Assalamu alaikum and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rabia Akhtar, Director, Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research at University of Lahore. Today, we are hosting a webinar entitled Vaccination of Freedom, Kashmir in the Age of Double Detention. We have an esteemed panel with us to deliberate on the subject. We are joined by Chairman, Board of Governors, University of Lahore, Mr. Awais Raoof, for his opening remarks. In our panel, we'll begin by listening to Mr. Javed Jabbar, who is a former senator and a public intellectual with distinctive achievements in diverse fields. And we have with us Ms. Victoria Schofield, the author of many books on Kashmir, an intellectual and a scholar who has been writing on Kashmir with the depth, compassion, and objectivity so desired on the subject. We'll close this first round of remarks by President AJK, Sardar Masood Khan, whose name has been synonymous with the cause he is fighting for the liberation of Kashmir. Their full bios will be available with the recording of this event on our YouTube channel later today. I request all of you to subscribe. When I was preparing for this seminar, I wrote my opening remarks, but then I deleted them. I deleted them for the words seemed shallow and rhetorical. Those were the things I had said before on several occasions, and yet it seemed that this time my own words appeared meaningless to me, and I was filled with despair. So today I'm here with questions only. Our panelists are all wise, thinking people, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to answer, however imperfectly, some difficult questions that are in the minds of the audience who joined us today, the Kashmiris who have tuned in from IIOJK and abroad, our students, and largely regular Pakistanis and Kashmiris. What we intend to explore is why, after a year into the pandemic, are the Kashmiris still invisible to the world? Why, despite all the Twitter hashtag campaigns, do Kashmiri lives matter, they still don't matter enough to move the international community at the UN? What is it that we are doing wrong? And what do we need to do to awaken the conscience of the international community against the brutality of the Indian occupation forces in the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir? I would like Mr. Awais Raoof to welcome the panel and make his opening remarks. And after that, we'll move to Mr. Javed Jabbar, Ms. Schofield, and President AJK for his remarks on the subject. Over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia. I would like to, on behalf of University of Lahore, would like to welcome the panelists. I would like to welcome the President AJK. He has been coming to our institution, coming to the very cause that we have been literally supporting. I would also like to welcome Ms. Schofield. It's good to see her again. This is the second time I will have the honor to have her with me on this panel as such a cause for Kashmir. And Javed Jabbar Sahab as well, welcome you to this session, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia, for inviting me to speak yet again on Kashmir and Kashmiris, a cause which is so close to my heart. I remember it's been more than a year that we got together, all of us, and nothing has really changed since then. The world has had the impact of COVID, while Kashmiris have remained under so-called double detention. They have been experiencing lockdown for more than a year now, nearly 2 years, and nothing much we've been able to do. So every time I have to put together some words for Kashmir, it looks very rhetorical to me. And I wonder when will obviously things change for them. And for our brothers and sisters, they can see a better future. Now, I would like to laud you and your center for being one of the few consistent voices on and for Kashmir. At least we here at University of Lahore can claim to be standing on the right side of history. Is that enough? Obviously not. We saw just recently how the world erupted when Gaza was being bombed in Palestine. It was a heartening and proud moment that Pakistan played a vital role in diffusing the recent crisis for the helpless oppressed from the colonizers. And when it comes to Kashmir, the situation is very much the same. Knowing Kashmir inside out would bear me out that there is an uncanny similarities between the Zionist treatment of Palestinians and the Hindu fascist treatment, brutal colonization of Kashmir. And the similarities have started to become more common as these two countries start to operate together. Same detention centers are now coming up in Kashmir, breaking down the cities, putting walls around them. All of that looks as if the same formula is being applied. And I'm sure uh, it will fail one day, but what is it that we can do that's what matters. From the killing fields of Kabul to the jail that is Gaza and the valley of death that is Kashmir, tyrants are playing havoc with the lives of innocent civilians, and their backers look the other way. While endeavors to bring normalcy in Afghanistan are underway, the Kashmiris and Palestinians are in search of saviors. I could not help but speak my heart out in our last webinar that we had. COVID was ripened, lockdown all over the world, but Kashmiris were already suffering. Since then, it's been more than 386 days. For Kashmir, nothing has changed. Situation has worsened. Lockdowns and basically no livelihoods. This is what Kashmiris are suffering with. We can imagine people who are not able to go out of their places. How do they manage to put bread on the table for their families? We've seen the vaccination campaigns all over the world. I don't know what is happening in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. I don't know what kind of healthcare is available to the people in Kashmir. Nobody in the world is talking about it. The world is so worried about COVID-19 for India, but not for the Kashmiris. I hope and I wish there's something that we can do. Maybe we can at least talk about it. Maybe we can make a lot of noise because in this age it matters. We saw in Gaza, and I'm so happy that the whole world recognized what Israel was doing, because Palestinians and their support all over the world were so actively promoting their cause, especially on social media. But when I look at Kashmir, nothing of that sort is happening. There must be something that we as Pakistanis are not able to do. This is what I think. There must be something that we're missing. And is it that we have decided to ignore the plight of people over there? Is it that we've decided to abandon the cause? It is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to me. It is not acceptable to a lot of people like us, to you, Dr. Rabia, to the President AJK, to Javed Jabbar Saab, Ms. Schofield. Somebody has to talk about them. Somebody has to come out and tell the world what is happening. We have many Kashmiri students with us, and one of them during recent lockdown said to me that, you see, sir, what they were doing to us, God is doing to the world. So, and I was speechless, and I'm every time this comes to my mind, there's nothing I can do, nothing I can say, but recognize that Providence probably is not happy, at least with us, for not doing anything. I raised this question with our Prime Minister, with our Army Chief, with fellow Pakistanis. While we are in lockdown as well, do we recognize the plight of our brethren on the other side? They are Pakistanis. And this is what was told to me when I was a kid. When I was studying in my primary school, it was told to me that they are us and we are them. And what is it that we are doing for them now? Without Kashmir, Pakistan is incomplete. This is what President AJK has been telling the world, and I totally agree with it. What is it that we're going to do for them is what matters. At the end, I thank Dr. Rabia for organizing all of this. I thank our panelists. Javed Jabbar Saab, you have been such a big figure in media. I know that people like you, when you come on a cause, it matters. I always request, and I'm sure you're doing it, that you need to tell the world, we all need to tell the world what is happening. Ms. Schofield, thank you very much for being a great supporter of this cause, for being a great lover of this country. Pakistan is a second home to you, you just told us. Thank you very much. All of you, I welcome you again. I'm so sure that our students, our youth from this side to the other side, when they will get to listen to what you're saying, it will matter. But yes, they have so many questions, and most of those questions I simply don't have any answer to. sometimes I believe nations have to sacrifice to liberate their brethren and sisters. I believe that Pakistan needs to do more. Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to say those things, but I believe that a great sacrifice is needed from our country. Thank you very much. I thank all our esteemed panelists for joining us at the University of Lahore. And I hope, Dr. Rabia, what you've organized for today will be a great success. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your heartfelt remarks. With this, I would like to invite Javed Jabbar sahab to make his formal remarks. Over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Rabia Akhtar and Mr. Awais Raoof, the University of Lahore, for giving me this privilege of participating with two outstanding individuals, Sardar Masood Khan Sahab, who is one of the most articulate representatives that Kashmir could have wished for. After that distinguished career in diplomacy, he has assumed a new direction with a very clear, strong, and at the same time, very comprehensive analysis each time he presents the case for Kashmir. And Victoria Schofield, a rare individual who never allows distance from distorting her comprehension of what the reality is on the ground, and her great empathy from a purely human point of view, quite apart from whether she is a friend of Pakistan or a friend of India, speaking as a global citizen. And her scholarship has been a great contribution. And Dr. Rabia Akhtar, thank you for harassing me and pursuing my participation of dubious value in this, because the subject, I compliment you on the formulation, first of all. The vaccination of freedom. I think it's a very, very powerful statement, the double detention element. And in my humble submissions, I'm not going to step away from the hard, brutal reality of what is happening and what has been so well expressed by Awais Raoof Saab. How much do we actually know of what's happening? I'm going to take a view that may appear distant, but in my own perspective, I think three elements that I will present for your consideration represent the disconnect, the dysfunction, the disjointedness of the age in which we live and of the times in which we consider the crisis of Kashmir in the year 2021. The first of these is the cruel and yet almost comical contrast between this, the most advanced stage of human planetary globalization, instant mass connectivity, where with the touch of a finger on a little button on a cell phone, one individual through the internet, through YouTube, can instantly communicate with 7 billion or at least those 4 billion people who also possess cell phones. My God, what a breathtaking phase of globalization this is. And yet, in this age of noise and sound, and unprecedented mass connectivity and access, there is a black hole of silence. That black hole of silence is Kashmir, or any place which a state or the telecom companies or what have you, in partnership or not in partnership, acting alone, they can silence 8 million human beings. I mean, in plain sight, or the equivalent of sound. We cannot hear Kashmir. The world is busy listening to each other and TikTok, and you can put on some of the most inane expressions of self-glorification, obsession with oneself, as personified with this wretched thing called the selfie. But Kashmir cannot take its own selfie. What a paradox. at a time when telecom and satellites have changed the world in ways that we have never seen before. And this, to my mind, is the first disconnect. The second disjoint is that even in countries where there is stable, uninterrupted democracy, no interruption, no military interventions, stable, uninterrupted, regular elections, peaceful transfer of power. Alas, a record that Pakistan cannot claim except for the last 12, 15 years. Yet, today in the world, it is at least 3 democracies which are stable, which are regular at holding elections and peaceful transfers of power, that have actually become dangerous democracies. Inimically dangerous to their own people or to those people who are under their control, or very aggressively posing threats to their immediate neighbors or to countries far away. And these are democracies. You normally expect this from dictatorships, from authoritarian single-party states. But look at the record. I mean, dear India, 73 years of uninterrupted democracy, multi-party democracy, supposedly no influence of the military in politics, representing the rich variety of India. Of course, it's truly justly proud of being a very pluralistic country. But look at the paradox. Second, Israel, which in order to resolve perhaps an unresolvable for that moment internal political crisis, the inability to form a coalition, despite many attempts, despite 3 elections, conveniently finds the holiest day in the month of Ramadan to initiate a crisis that diverts attention from the internal political crisis, imbues this gentleman who continues to occupy office, and there he goes, he's home free and running. He'll probably now be able to form a coalition. And yet, even if he doesn't, Israel in its behavior, while at the same time practicing democracy, a very admirable achievement. And there are many admirable achievements of Israel, but it's a democracy that is perpetrating conscious, wanton cruelty on people under its own control. And thirdly, of course, the United States, not because it's everyone's favorite target, but we have to refer to the United States because it prides itself on its exceptionalism. It's exceptionalism. But I mean, either the absurdity of the electoral system in which all 3 countries live, partly, and I'm not being parochial, inherited unquestioningly from Westminster, this first past the post electoral system. And if you just get one absurd vote more than your competitor, you get a license to rule for 5 years or representing that constituency. On the basis of these absurdities of the electoral system that we don't want to fix, because the majorities elected through these absurd electoral systems do not want to suffer a loss of power if those electoral systems are made into, let us say, compulsory voting, made it obligatory for a winning candidate to get minimum 50% plus 1 vote so that you can say, I represent the majority. What do we have in the United States? We have a man who loses the popular vote substantially and then proceeds to direct the country away from very painfully negotiated international agreements, painfully executed terms of engagement in different parts of the world, unleashes a new level of hate against non-whites, against non-Christians, democracy, democracy at work. And of course, this phenomenon is there in other parts of the world, in West Europe and so on. But these three dangerous democracies highlight the need for the world to look at the consequences. What are the people of Kashmir suffering as a result of the fact that a party and an alliance that got only 37% of the Indian vote in 2018, 37%, 63% of the voters of India vote against the BJP, but because of the first past the post system, they get the majority and they change the whole structure of Kashmir. They violate their own constitution. They abandon the UN Security Council resolutions. Doesn't mean anything to them. Trample on the solemn commitments made to the people of Kashmir. The third disjointed dimension that comes to mind is that we have in 2021 perhaps the most comprehensive structure and system of cooperation and coordination between nation states in history. Never before have we had laws of the sea, laws on telecommunications, civil aviation, trade, health, currency, what have you. My God, it's such a beautiful spectacle. The European Union is one microcosm, but with all its flaws and impediments, the structure that we have evolved after the Second World War is really magnificent, magnificent. We cooperate on so many facets of global activity. And yet that very system is unable to address equitably issues of conflict resolution. Equitably, where a veto power wielding member is not interfering. We have East Timor, we have South Sudan, we have other examples where the UN conflict resolution mechanism has worked admirably. But wherever any of the five powers have either a vested interest or an alliance with the party that is violating international law, that whole incredibly well-constructed system and structure is totally paralyzed and pulverized, whether it is in Palestine or whether it is in Kashmir. And therefore, this brings to mind that despite the sanctity of equality epitomized by the UN General Assembly, it is sheer military power, sheer brute military power that determines what will happen in Srinagar and what will happen in Jerusalem. So, towards the conclusion, I won't take perhaps more than 2 minutes more. Kashmir raises the issue of the very nature of the nation state. Where are we headed with the system that we have evolved? Is this the structure of the nation state going to be a permanent reality? Should it not be questioned? How do we protect ourselves against predator states? States that are able to annex territory which is disputed on a world stage and hope to get away with it and smiling like a cat. How do we formulate mechanisms that deter democracies from becoming dangerous not only to their own people, but to their neighbors? And I just want to share with you a chilling encounter just 2 days ago with a gentleman in a webinar on Kashmir. And the organizers, who were based in London, Victoria's good town, this gentleman really stupefied me, because he says, amongst other things, 1947 was a big mistake. So when I got a chance to rebut him, I said, you mean a mistake in the sense, you mean India should not have been created in 1947, because obviously Pakistan, I mean, we are delighted at the, but he still in 2021, this is a member of the BJP speaking in an international seminar saying 1947 was a big mistake. All right. Then I referred to 1999 and I said, are you aware that your leader, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Prime Minister of India, visited the Minar of Pakistan in February 1999 and acknowledged the reality and the legitimacy of Pakistan? What does he say? He said, Vajpayees have gone. Vajpayees, forget Vajpayees, forget Vajpayees. The a leader of the BJP is now talking about forgetting Vajpayee. We are facing a very horrendous demon that has seized electoral power in India. So what do? I think Pakistan should be commended for persevering. Awais Raoof was not happy with what Pakistan is doing, but what more can we do? I mean, there is, of course, much more we can do. We can invest in our external projection much more than we have. We should have a communication strategy, a public diplomacy strategy that can be far more effective than it has been. And there certainly needs to be, but specifically on the Indo-Pakistan bilateral level, the 4-point formula evolved after years of back channel, track 2, track 1 needs to be revisited. And if the two governments don't want to give credit to the previous ones, let them remodel it and go forward. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very insightful remarks. I don't know if the system is unable to address equitably. I see it as organized hypocrisy, because where they want to make concessions, they do. But your comments are really insightful and thought-provoking, and I hope this will generate some debate as well. I would now like to move to Ms. Victoria Schofield. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody in Pakistan. I'm greeting you here from London. I would, of course, like to start by thanking you, Dr. Rabia Akhtar, and also Awais Raoof, very much for your comments, and the University of Lahore. It's always a privilege, and it's becoming increasingly an easier privilege to sit at one's laptop. I hope it won't be the new way forward, because I like being able to visit Pakistan for conferences. You lose the networking and the personal contact by just talking on the screen. But at least it is a valuable means during this very difficult period that we've all been going through. And I think my remarks have to be prefaced by, we have to bear in mind that for everybody, this has been an incredibly difficult period. It's been absolutely unprecedented in our lives. And it is true, as Mr. Javed Jabbar has said, we have this extraordinary ability to communicate in the 21st century. But, and thank goodness we have got that for this present period, but at the same time, it's been a very frightening period, I think, for all countries, because they haven't known how this COVID pandemic is going to manifest itself. And so I can't say that we've been acting normally. We've been carrying on as best we can in our different ways, but I can't say that any country has managed to have the same impact or act normally the way it would have done had there not been the COVID pandemic. And I think that's true for rich, poor, strong, weak, all societies. And we have to say also what a terrible time India is going through at the moment with the COVID pandemic. For the poor people. We talk about governments, but those governments sit on top of millions of people. And I think I'm hoping that Pakistan, and I note from the statistics, is doing a lot better than what's going on in India, because truly that situation is tragic. So I just want to preface my general remarks, and I'm also not going to broaden my comments to talk about the situation in Israel either in what's happened with the Palestinians, because again, it's a truly terrible situation. But I'm going to focus on the subject today, which of course is Kashmir. And it is true, many of you will know who've read my work. I have been focusing on the issue for many decades now. I'm sad to say that I'm continuing to focus on it because I would like to have seen it resolved a generation ago. What I am seeing now is that a whole new generation has grown up in conflict. And I think this is one of the most tragic aspects, is the continuation without resolution means that a whole new generation of young people are suffering. And what I'd like to start by saying, I think I'm going to make 5 main points, is that we must bear in mind, we're not talking about real estate. We're not talking about a piece of territory that can be bartered between one country or another. We are talking about the lives of millions of people. One death is too many deaths. And since the late 1980s, early 1990s, even by conservative statistics, 80,000 people have died. Widows have been half widows, people who don't know if their husbands have died, the children who've been orphaned. The human rights, as we say, we can focus on. And I think we are fortunate in this period at the moment, because there are 2 United Nations reports on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir. And I think this is a very important milestone. I know there's huge frustration at what the international community hasn't done and what the United Nations hasn't done, but there have been small contributions. And these 2018, 2019 UN reports are worth reading. So what we have to say, and we have to acknowledge, is that until there is a resolution of the issue, and this is my second point, there are going to continue to be human rights abuses. And so while we can castigate those human rights abuses, we can point to them, we can commiserate, but there has to be a resolution. And Javed Jabbar, you just mentioned as so-called Musharraf 4-point formula. If we go back in time, there were previous politicians who also recommended the same formula. It just happened to get the Musharraf formula, but I know certainly from talking to Benazir Bhutto, she had these ideas in mind. So whatever, let's forget the title and move on with a new formula that would help to bring peace to this region. Now, what I think is also very true, and I say this as a historian who's been studying the issue for many years, as I've said, is that we have to focus, particularly when we're trying to attract the international community to understand the issue, we have to focus on what the issue is. And I know as a journalist, as a writer, we talk about Kashmir, but if we want to go back, we want to go back to 1947 to understand what is the Kashmir issue. And that means it is the dispute over the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir in its entirety. And I know that Pakistan has produced a new map which outlines as you now call it, the IIOJK. I think acronyms are all very well, but for an international audience, we do need to spell that. That means the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, which of course, as you know, is not an acceptable title to India because they maintain that the IIOJK is part of India. So we have to be very clear in terms of what we're talking about. But the Valley of Kashmir is only a fractional aspect of resolution regarding the state of Jammu and Kashmir. As you well know, the status of Gilgit-Baltistan, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, which of course the Indians refer to as Pakistan occupied Kashmir, Jammu region, Kashmir Valley, small percentage in terms of territory, 90 miles long, 20 to 25 miles wide, and then of course the vast expanse of Ladakh. The lives of all these people actually are on hold because this entire region is disputed territory. Again, you refer back to the UN resolutions. So I think when you're talking to the international community, this is why it's confusing for them. And certainly it's confusing. I've myself addressed to students. I've even had one student say, well, Jammu, that's next door to Kashmir, isn't it? As though it's a separate region whose future is not in dispute. So if there's any first step, it is clarification of what is the disputed Kashmir issue. It's the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir as it was in 1947, a former princely state. I feel, again, and I don't always like to resort to what I've said before, but I do have to make this point, that while this situation is not resolved, the billions which is spent on military confrontation between India and Pakistan, which is not being spent on poverty eradication, development, education of both populations, is really absolutely reprehensible, because both countries, you both are running out of water. There is going to be a water shortage. You're both sitting on a demographic time bomb. And I think this is terribly important, not to just think money is a bottomless pit, that what one really needs to work out that what's being allocated in one region is not going to another region. And so I think this is, as I say, it's my fourth point, that don't forget that while this issue is unresolved, all peoples are losing out, because they're not having the development, the education, the poverty eradication, which they could be having. Now, fifthly, it is a huge challenge post-August 2019. As a Kashmiri friend of mine said, it's like we've been playing a game of chess. We've been moving pieces on the chessboard, but suddenly one player has decided to just toss the board away and start all over again. And I think it is very difficult, because prior to 2019, we were always talking about resolution, referring back to a formula that would bring peace to this region. Because as I've said, until there is peace to this region, until there's resolution, there's going to continue to be human rights abuses. But post-2019, when the government of India has very clearly shown that it has a way forward, which doesn't include a dialogue with Pakistan, or indeed with the inhabitants of the state. And I think this is key, that what was done in 2019 was done without consultation, without conference with the inhabitants whose future is at stake. And we can talk about the statistics of lockdown and how many days it was locked down, and the extraordinary cutting off of the internet, as Javed Jabbar has said, it's something we now take for granted. We're taking it for granted now that we can talk. I'm in London and you're in Pakistan. Unprecedented situation. So what is this impasse that we're now in? How are we going to resolve it? And that is very difficult. Clearly, there is a feeling that the international community needs to be on board. And I think what we've seen in these decades, unfortunately, notwithstanding how close India and Pakistan reportedly became in 2006, 2007 to resolution, I think it's been very clear that this bilateral attempt to resolve with a representative selection of the inhabitants of the state has not worked. Now, what I would like to suggest, and given that I've done so much research, I've been rereading a lot of documents, and I think something which is overlooked, and again, this is played into the international community, the number of Foreign Office briefings I've attended where other officials say, and it's very easy for the international community to say, well, we can't do anything because it's a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. They agreed in 1972, it's similar agreement, that it would be a bilateral issue. So we can't involve ourselves. But I would like to make sure that readily available now on the internet, one rereads the similar agreement. And if you look at that clause, it does state that India and Pakistan agreed to resolve their issues bilaterally. But there's a very vital subclause, or by any other means mutually agreed upon. And so international facilitation, mediation, any kind of help that would possibly contribute to breaking the impasse has not been ruled out. And I think this is a narrative which has been captured actually by the Indian government and has been pursued. And I think from Pakistan's point of view, it will be high time to continue to highlight that you did not rule out any international, any other means mutually agreed upon. Of course, the challenge is to get them mutually agreed upon, but I think this is really quite important. And it's been sort of, as I say, captured in the narrative. It's been captured in the narrative that the whole state is part of India. And we've just seen recently these very threatening remarks that actually one of the next objectives of the Indian government, the current BJP government, is to get back Gilgit-Baltistan, which they maintain is part of the disputed state of India. Even if you look at their map, that whole region is included as part of India. So I regret to say we're a long way. In fact, I would say we've even taken steps backwards, as the French would say, en arrière, since I've been following this dispute. But I feel for the sake of the people, one must never give up hope, because they are absolutely wonderful people. And I was last in the Valley of Kashmir in 2019. I was unable to go, not because of the Indian government, but because of the COVID situation in 2020, when I had another visit planned. And they deserve to lead the lives that we, and I talk particularly about myself in the West, in the privileged West, but also in Pakistan, where you have rule of law, you have freedom of movement, freedom of expression, you can have weddings and funerals without a military occupation. And I think this is the challenge, because with a military occupation, you are going to get, as I say, continuing human rights abuses. And so somewhere is the key to unlock this. And as I say, as a member of the international community, I think our duty is to keep talking about it, to keep an awareness, to maintain the news item, because otherwise the issues can get lost. They can get lost on the public agenda because other terrible things are happening in the world as well, and people tend to forget. But I think these are very important points. So I'd like to thank you once again very much for listening to me and for inviting me to speak on this seminar and this webinar. And as I say, we mustn't lose hope, because I think if one loses hope, then of course one loses everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Brilliantly articulated as always. And thank you for drawing our attention to the fine print. And I think that's probably where Pakistan now needs to direct its energies to break this narrative of bilateral issue and find space for more conversation with the broader international community. And I'll get back to you in one of the questions that I have for you about setting the narrative right later. So thank you so much.
Rabia, sorry, I did omit to salute President Sardar Masood Khan. So might I just greet you from London? We've shared many platforms, and we were most recently in Turkey at a conference, I think 2 years ago. So I just wanted to say my greetings to you, President. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With this, I'd like to now invite President AJK Masood Khan sir for your formal remarks, sir. Please unmute at your end. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much.
Dr. Rabia.
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Rabia Akhtar, thank you so much for organizing this webinar, taking this initiative on Kashmir once again. I'm grateful to you, and I'm sure that we will enjoy some technical problems, but okay, I fixed them. Let me start. First, I would say that I was really moved by the speech that was made by Mr. Awais Raoof. he raised some very important questions. Of course, he tried to grope for some answers. And we're still trying to find the kind of approach that we should adopt at the national level and at the international level to resolve the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. So it was a very, very compelling statement that he made right in the beginning. And it is a dream panel that you have gathered together. I admire, of course, Mr. Javed Jabbar, and I've been listening to him for years, and he's an authority on many issues related to Pakistan, and it's very eloquent. And today also he raised some very substantive points. And Victoria Schofield, she's been a historian, an analyst, and a supporter of the Kashmir cause very steadfastly, and we're grateful to her for her contribution to advancing the cause of freedom of Kashmir. Thank you so much, and the rights of the realization of the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So let me go straight to the subject. First, I would like to recapitulate the situation, unless it is forgotten. The situation in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is horrendous, and Kashmir, as we all know, has been under siege since August the 5th, 2019, almost 2 years. Kashmiris have been under military siege. There is a war going on in Kashmir, but one side, which is the Indian side, with 900,000 troops, is fully equipped, and their opponent are Kashmiris who are unarmed, and majority of them, 99.99%, are non-combatants. And they do not have weaponry, they do not have ammunition, they do not have any supply chains for weapons, and according to the statistics released by Indians, the number of so-called militants is not more than 150, pitted against 900,000 troops. This is a stark reality which we must recognize. So here you have a besieged, imprisoned population in a large concentration camp. The second thing is that every day there are killings going on in the territory, particularly of young men, particularly of teenagers who flee their homes to seek refuge in the forests or orchards, and then they come back to fight this mighty force there. The third is detentions. All these illegal detentions under draconian laws are an abiding phenomenon of Indian tyranny, and these people who have been detained, their number should be not less than 14,000, including young boys and even children, and all political activists. They are either in concentration camps or in the most notorious prison houses where they're being tortured. And their only crime is that they want freedom, that they want their another dimension that I want to highlight is this deliberate, systematic change in the demographic composition of the territory. This has to be understood. This is not an ordinary transfer of population, although transfer of population in the occupied territory, in any occupied territory, is a grave violation of the 4th Geneva Convention, and it's a violation of other statutes, I mean the ICC statute and also Security Council resolutions. This has to be understood. These are war crimes that India is committing with impunity. And when we're talking about demographic composition, what we see is that in the past several months, I mean, starting April 2019, India has imported and illicitly transferred some 3 million Hindus from all over India to settle them in Kashmir. They have been issued domicile certification so that they now become citizens of Kashmir, so that they introduce this disequilibrium in the demographic composition. So this is what is happening there. Second point that I want to make is that we, the people of Jammu and Kashmir, whether we are in Azad Kashmir or in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, we are grateful to the state of Pakistan, to the government of Pakistan, to all the state institutions, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because since August 2019, they have been trying very hard to attract the attention of the world community. They have succeeded to some extent. For instance, they were able to take the issue of Jammu and Kashmir back to the Security Council, and it was discussed there behind the scenes, of course, after a lapse of 50 years. There have been some successes. Let me also tell you that the crux of the matter is that the people of Jammu and Kashmir have been striving for the realization of their right to self-determination. So it is a political issue and it's a human rights issue. It is not a unidimensional issue. It is not about human rights alone. It is not about our territory. It is not about just self-determination. It is about the nationhood, the political will of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. This has to be understood because we should not fragment Kashmir issue and emphasize that we should focus on one aspect and not the other. Move to some very, very difficult issues. One is that I think that we have a comfort zone in regard to Kashmir. And what is that comfort zone? We think, can you still hear me?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, can you still hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Okay. So what I was saying that our comfort zone is that, and probably you can't call it comfort zone. What we're saying is that, or what we believe in is that we are dealing with Kashmir as we used to deal with it before August 5th, 2019. But the ground realities have changed radically. And we haven't made that shift towards post-2019 scenario. India has changed it, as it was pointed out by Ms. Victoria Schofield, that they have tried to foist and impose a unilateral solution in regard to the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. But our position is by and large static. It ought to be, in a sense, because we anchor our policy and our approach in the UN Security Council resolutions, because from there stem the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, including the right to self-determination. Second phenomenon that I want to highlight is reductionism. We indulge in this reductionism because we are in that comfort zone. We have not taken into account the groundswell of support that has been extended by the international community in the immediate aftermath of Indian actions. I can tell you that in August, September, and October 2019, the world media, some of the most conservative and pro-Indian media, they spoke up for the Kashmiris and they showed understanding for the stand taken by the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Pakistan. So, I mean, that was a big change, which has not been fully registered in Pakistan. But when we were given this higher threshold of support, then we were supposed to, we the people of Pakistan and Jammu and Kashmir, were supposed to build on that. But what happened that in October, or to be more precise, November 2019, the momentum started petering out. And so I call this reductionism, because you do not recognize the importance, we did not recognize the importance, the potential of the international support. The second thing is that in Pakistan, public opinion was galvanized like never before, from Karachi to Punjab, from Gilgit to Muzaffarabad, everywhere. The public sentiment was very, very vibrant, and that was a new momentum which we should have valued, and that has been lost to some extent. The third thing that we haven't noticed is that the diaspora community, Pakistani Kashmiri diaspora community, made Kashmir after August 2019 an international movement, as a matter of fact. And they had these huge, big demonstrations in London, in Paris, in Brussels, in Strasbourg, in Manhattan, all around the world. This was your diaspora community which led these demonstrations. Now, I'm raising this question of the tenacity that we should have shown as a nation. And that tenacity has not been there. Now, another thing that I want to highlight is that we tend to make Kashmir, or Palestine to be more precise, a surrogate for Kashmir, because Kashmir is Kashmir and Palestine is Palestine, and they're linked, of course. And when our government, our state institutions are public, they raise their voices for Palestine. That's something very welcome. I, as Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations, both in Geneva and in New York, and particularly in Geneva, I worked day in and day out to fight for the rights of the Palestinians. But, you know, we think that we are getting this vicarious gratification in regard to Kashmir by steering campaigns on Palestine. Palestine is important for the entire international community. Another point that I want to raise is tokenism. You know, and if you talk to the people abroad or even in Pakistan, on February the 5th, the Kashmir Solidarity Day, before or after that day, people would say that we have given ourselves to tokenism, which means that we observe these days and we make these passionate rhetorical speeches, but the follow-up is very weak. And we're satisfied with that kind of activity. Now, that kind of activity can never create critical mass. I mean, that's important. That's an important threshold, no doubt about that. Another point that I want to make is that the key to the solution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is not New York, I mean the United Nations, although they have given these resolutions, and they have given the right to self-determination to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, which was recognized by the two reports which were published by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018 and 2019, too. But the key is in Washington, not in New York, not in the Security Council chambers, because right now, we agree or not, the writ is that of the United States. You know, India acts with impunity and commits these crimes against humanity without any accountability because of its strategic partnership with the United States. The United States continues to remain the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. And what they say goes, as a matter of fact. United Nations, when we go to the United Nations, of course, I mean, again, you face the writ of the United States. You have the United States followed by the United Kingdom and France very faithfully as permanent members. Russian Federation sits on the fence, and China can facilitate Pakistan's Pakistan's request for some focus on Kashmir from time to time. But the most decisive voice is that of Washington. There's no doubt about it. So Kashmir is core, so is Palestine, in the strategic dynamic, global strategic dynamics. The profits tied up with India, the United States and the Western world's profits with India. And the United States and United States led Western Bloc, its strategic posture vis-a-vis China. Let me also warn everybody that because of COVID-19, because of huge diversions in other areas, the emergence of a new administration in the United States, India has now this very, very protected space as far as Kashmir is concerned. Pakistan's attention is diverted, the world community's attention is diverted, and they are going ahead full speed to implement their nefarious agenda, their fascist agenda. So India is in fact changing reality on the ground and intends to get away with it. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I mean, some uncertainty has crept up. And the reason is that in the recent past, of course, there was the ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan, or the reinstatement, restoration of the ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan along the line of control. And this is a good thing, a step in the right direction, because we have saved many lives since then. But also, people started speculating about a bilateral engagement between India and Pakistan. And that confused the citizens of Pakistan and also the international community. And this has led to a period of uncertainty and ambiguity, because if Pakistan sits on a bilateral table with India after August the 5th, 2019, without any preconditions, this would be tantamount to endorsement of Indian actions, illegal actions in the territory. So we have to be very cautious about this because India now wants this kind of indemnity, this kind of nod from Pakistan, deliberate or inadvertent. So we have to be very careful. And now, another thing that I want to highlight is that, in Pakistan, there's this tendency to rely too heavily on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have been part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I know their strengths and their limitations. Diplomats are diplomats. They are not politicians. On Kashmir, leadership has to come from politicians, political parties, their heads, from the parliamentarians, parliamentary committees. Also, they have to, in fact, talk to the international parliamentary forums, IPU, Inter-Parliamentary Union, or they have to talk to their counterparts, I mean, political parties in Europe or United States or in Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific region. And that's not being done. As a matter of fact, they think that the foreign ministry has a magic key, and their golden words in the United Nations, in the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council, or outside the Security Council, will somehow turn the tide and would help us resolve the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. That's not going to happen, as a matter of fact. What I'm saying is that politicians or political leadership should first transcend their differences, craft a common platform, and reach out to their counterparts in the world. Another aspect that I've been highlighting in the recent past is that we must reach out to citizens, global citizens. I mean, when Israel attacked Palestinians at Al-Aqsa and later on bombardment of Hamas in Hamas, the world citizenry got involved. Streets responded to the situation. They spoke up. Now, streets all around the world, mostly in regard to Kashmir, are silent. And as far as the governments are concerned, they are guided by realpolitik, their interests, bloc politics, emerging bloc politics, emerging bipolarity or multipolarity, whatever you call it. So citizens, only citizens can transform the situation and prepare the ground for the realization of the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I would also like to point out that let's be very, very clear that in the present world order, a predator, a terrorist, a fascist state like India can get away with murder, with genocide, with ethnic cleansing. And the law is ineffective because at the international level, it is might is right. It is not the rule of law. And that is a deep, debilitating malady in our international system right now. I also have warned the people of Pakistan that it is not just about Kashmir, it is also about Pakistan. Today it is Kashmir, which is being brutalized and which is under colonial and fascist rule. Tomorrow the situation might lead to the disintegration of Pakistan itself, because this BJP zealot that Mr. Javed Jabbar was talking about, they're bent upon disintegrating Pakistan. They haven't accepted the existence of Pakistan. And that's why they have launched their proxies in the form of insurrection and terrorism and in many other forms to polarize the state of Pakistan. I'm not being paranoid. This is the writing on the wall. And in fact, I can cite statement after statement which has been made by the BJP leadership, the RSS leadership, and the serving cabinet ministers. A couple of points, last 2 points that I want to make. One is that when we talk about out-of-the-box solutions, I have always pointed out that inside the box, you have Kashmiris. Don't forget them. If you're out of box means that you don't consult Kashmiris, that you try to strike deals in Delhi, in Islamabad, or probably in New York without the presence and participation of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, that solution is never going to work. Kashmir, by definition, is not a bilateral issue. It was not a bilateral issue, even if you go back to the 1947 Independence Act. But once you took the issue to the Security Council, it became instantly an international issue. And the similar agreement, as it was rightly pointed out by Ms. Victoria Schofield, doesn't banish any kind of international engagement or involvement of the United Nations. It is written into that treaty also. In fact, India talks about bilateralism, but it wants to take unilateral decisions to be endorsed by Pakistan. This is their definition of bilateralism. And let me reiterate that there are 3 parties to the dispute: Pakistan, India, and the people of Jammu and Kashmir. And the people of Jammu and Kashmir are the key constituent, the key party to the dispute. And let me also reiterate that United Nations is also a party or a guarantor or custodian of its own resolutions. So India's emphasis on bilateralism, disingenuous as it is designed to keep the United Nations away from the entire process and also to exclude Kashmiris from any talk, any discourse on Kashmir. Last point that I want to make is that Kashmiris have given some 500,000 people have given their sacrifice in search of freedom, dignity, and self-determination. They are continuing their struggle today as we speak. And ultimately, Kashmiri ultimately, what I want to say is the Kashmiris will liberate their land and people, and they would stop being international community's orphans. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Let me just mute at your end. All right. Thank you so much for such a refreshing roundup and your brilliant articulation of as to how this issue needs to be looked at. I would now want Mr. Javed Jabbar and Ms. Victoria to come out with some comments, if you have, on President's remarks on the subject, because he has put a lot of stuff on the table, with respect to how he has articulated the whole thing, the comfort zone, reductionism, tokenism, key to solution where rests with Washington, global citizens are silent on Kashmir, Palestine not a surrogate for Kashmir, and the writing on the wall and out of the box solution cannot come without Kashmir. A lot of stuff is packed here. I would, pose a question to Mr. Javed Jabbar, and then I would give him the mic to, make his comments, and also if he wants to comment on the President's remarks. So Javed, over the past few decades, you have seen Pakistan's media evolve into a powerful element and player in the country's polity. On the back of all your experience with media, what do you suggest to the government of Pakistan when it comes to effectively exploiting a rather difficult global media landscape for impactful strategic communications on Kashmir? We have seen that due to the use of videos made from photos that went viral by the Palestinians and the media stationed in Gaza reporting live on the attacks conducted by the Israeli forces, the Palestinian cause was propelled and effectively highlighted, made it to the headlines. But we don't see that for Kashmir due to communications blackouts. So what needs to change about that? So over to you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rabia Akhtar. And I really compliment Victoria Schofield and the President of Azad Jammu and Kashmir for very incisive comments. I endorse all that they have said, and not by way of saying me too, but it's so pertinent to remember what Victoria Schofield said about the multilateral scope of Simla, because Simla begins by saying that the Simla Agreement will be governed by the principles and the Charter of the United Nations. And then you look at the Charter and the principle, they are rooted in the concept of multilateralism. And therefore, unmemorably, I also humbly wrote an essay about 12 years ago, titled Back to Simla, Forward to Peace. If we want to go forward to peace, we have to go back and rediscover what Simla really meant. And there, I'm sorry to say, at the highest levels of our state leadership, political leadership, we have failed because we have implicitly accepted the Indian version of Simla. And because I've been involved in Track 2 and continue to be for a long time, I notice that the Indians use this as a systematic part of their disinformation strategy. President Masood Khan has very aptly pointed out that you should not rely upon the Foreign Office alone. It does not have the wherewithal and the resources. We need a very vigorous public diplomacy campaign, which so far has remained restricted largely to the Foreign Office. And we should not blame anyone. The world is far too busy for it to always be paying attention to Kashmir. We have to grab the world's attention. And for that, I wish immediately after 9/11, we had set up our own global television, radio systems. I wrote about that in Dawn at that time. We didn't work on this. More recently, there have been improvements, but that's a bare scratch. Look at how imaginatively Al Jazeera became a name that is recognized as a fairly credible international television channel. Even in the world of social media, TV does have its own impact, and we desperately need to create a credible, independent, globally accessible media presence. Now, when I say credible, it cannot afford to sound like a propaganda arm of the state of Pakistan, saying that Pakistan is a bed of milk and honey, everything we do is right. It has to have the capacity to be self-critical and at the same time be scorchingly critical of what India is doing. And that's a very difficult formula to work out. How do you facilitate the growth of a system of communication where the state and the people of Pakistan are willing to be? And you've got to take into account, unfortunately, one of the greatest impediments that Pakistan faces in selling the case for Kashmir is tragically an extremely negative image of Pakistan worldwide. Compared to India, with all its atrocities, it manages to exude a much more positive, pluralistic, democratic, culturally open image. Our image consists of extremism, fanaticism, military dictatorship, and instability, coupled with our potentially gifting nuclear weapons to terrorists. Now, to correct this terribly negative image, we should have been investing tens of millions of dollars. We are very good at running up debt for all the wrong reasons. But this is a cause where we need to run up debt for the right reason. Every dollar that we will invest in gradually correcting our image. And the classic is 9.5 out of every 10 foreigners I meet in Pakistan who are visiting Pakistan for the first time say, my God, this country is so different from how I thought it was, if I go by how the media present Pakistan. And look at we have not invested. We just don't put money into it. So unless you put hard cash down, buy space and time, build credibility, allow the media to be critical about the state and the governments of Pakistan, and at the same time project Kashmir in a credible way, that is the way forward. It can be done. We have enormously gifted people. We are underutilizing our human resources in this respect. We have a very gifted diaspora. So at the highest strategic level, global communications has to be given the priority and the primacy at the cabinet level that it has never received. I hope that the present leadership realizes it. The steps it is taking are very limited. And thank God that we have an articulate person as head of state of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, he alone is making up for the enormous deficit that continues to face us. I am glad to tell you, and I conclude here, that there are steps now being belatedly taken in this direction, but those are still very limited. And I think the people of Pakistan, it's not just a state responsibility. We are such a compassionate and generous nation. The private sector of Pakistan, the citizens of Pakistan, when it comes to giving money to worthy causes, are amongst the most generous in the world. If the government leads an initiative, we can tap into resources for philanthropy, which have not been exploited, to enable the financing of international communications. When India was holding 93,000 prisoners of war, 42,000 soldiers, 50,000 civilians, I had the privilege of writing full-page ads for the Times of London, for the New York Times, and we focused attention on India's violation of law and the Geneva Conventions. And we think we contributed to raising awareness. Now, we can do much more now. And therefore, it's up to the government to take that initiative and show the way, and some citizens who also need to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javed. I think this is global communications. Pakistan needs to put the money where its mouth is in order to make a difference. So thank you so much for that. I would now like to ask Victoria. I cannot help but mention how appropriately you titled one of the chapters in your seminal book as, Valley of Tears. Of course, the tears are flowing with no one there to stop them. Why does the international community talk about human rights violations in conflict zones all over the world, but Kashmir does not fit this narrative as neatly as others do? And you've made some reference to it in your remarks. So the floor is yours. And if you want to comment on what President AJK also said, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabia. I think, again, maybe we shouldn't keep talking about the international community. There has been an enormous amount written. And I think it's unfortunately, it's one of these issues, as I've said, that it flares up when there's something happening and then it gets forgotten. The president has mentioned, even amongst the Pakistani community, the diaspora, there were huge demonstrations. I myself went to one in outside the Houses of Parliament in London after August 2019. But again, people get on with their lives if they haven't got direction, if they haven't got a plan. And so what you need is a plan. And I think that's the challenge, because it's to keep up the momentum. And we are talking about an issue that's been stop-start, ever since 1947. And without really getting to grips with what can be done. Again, the formulas, the initiatives, these are all very well, but they need to be followed through and carried through to fruition. And particularly in relation to the international community, as I say, it's a complicated issue. It's complex. It's actually more complex in a way than Palestine. And I think I endorse what Javed Jabbar has said, that you need to have coming out of Pakistan, not propaganda, because then it doesn't sit well. People think, well, that's not actually the story. And of course, it's absolutely true to say that Prime Minister Vajpayee did come to Lahore in 1999. But what else was happening in 1999? Kargil was happening in 1999. And this, I'm afraid, was a huge trust deficit. And not really very well explained. Nobody, as I said, until Naseem Zehra wrote her book 17 years later, nobody could quite understand what had gone on in Pakistan, that when they were in the middle of a peace process, there was suddenly an incursion across the line of control. And so these aspects, if you want a coherent narrative, you need to have these aspects addressed and explained, because otherwise, the so-called international community. And as I say, there are an enormous number of writers like myself and commentators and think tanks who are looking at Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir. But, as I say, we tend to lump it all together as the international community. But you need a narrative which is credible, as Javed Jabbar has said. But I think equally, I confess, we are in a different phase. And I've talked about bilateralism. I've talked about there's no shame in having a facilitator, mediator. But what you are up against is a country which has even thrown that bilateralism out of the window and took a unilateral act. And that is very difficult, because then, prefaced by the president's comments, might is right. It's very difficult. India is in possession of the territory and in control of the lives of the people it wants to control. As I say, threatening remarks apart about taking control of Gilgit-Baltistan. So it's very difficult to unseat someone who's already in possession of that territory. And there's a raft of other issues in the world to be dealt with. But so I don't want in any way, and I know I'm in touch with a lot of my Kashmiri friends. I'm almost daily in touch. When Facebook's working, I'm in touch with them daily in the Valley of Kashmir. They're not forgotten. But I think what's missing at the moment, in particular, and as I say, I'm also at a quandary, is what can be done when you've got a country which has taken a unilateral action. And I think it's very challenging at the moment. And as the president has rightly said, I mean, his comments were absolutely right in terms of a reduction, because you know in Pakistan you know what to do on February the 5th. You'll observe Pakistan Day, or in September, but then what more can you do? And equally, you can't go to war with India, because it's you know, it bring untold sorrow for your populations. I want to make one point about the 2003 ceasefire line, which is luckily, as I say, thankfully been restored, but it did send a conflicting message, because I was suddenly finding in my own country, people were saying, oh, that means India and Pakistan are getting back to negotiating, you know, everything's going to be fine, sort of, so to speak. But it has put Pakistan in a very difficult position, because you can't have a situation where you put restrictions on talking to India, but at the same time, because then India just says, well, you know, preconditions, we're not going to talk, we don't need to talk. On the other hand, if you do talk to India, it does appear that you have accepted what the Indian government has done in relation to Article 370. So Pakistan is in a very difficult position. But I would say my best advice is to reach out to friendly countries. It doesn't have to be the United Kingdom or the United States, actually. I mean, I agree with Javed, the US is an incredibly powerful country, and the president mentioned this, but a country that's respected by both sides, like a facilitator like Norway or Sweden, or some country that can, in a way, work as a sort of break between the two countries' hostility. That you need something like that. But you know, I can't say that I can look into the crystal ball and wave a magic wand, but until that magic wand has been waved, you're going to continue to have this conflict situation with India, and the inhabitants of this region are continue not to be able to lead their lives in fulfillment as we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for putting it as it is. The reality, you know, is ugly. I agree. International community is not a homogeneous entity, and we should not lump everybody together. But in order to keep the momentum, you're right, direction is needed, a plan is needed, and we don't have that at the moment. I would wrap the session up by going to President AJK. There are some questions that have been posed. Due to the paucity of time, I will not be able to take all the questions, but sir, I would like you to answer some of them. We have a question from Iftikhar Gilani, who says, why Pakistan is not questioning ICRC, and why have they stopped visiting jails in Kashmir or to meet Kashmiri prisoners that are in various Indian jails? And another question is, that by Qasim Khan, and he says that, do you think Pakistan's job is getting more difficult given the younger Kashmiri diaspora in UK and US are increasingly talking about Kashmir's independence from both Pakistan and India? How do you look at these two questions? And if you have any comments to make on Javed Jabbar's and Victoria's comments. Over to you, sir. Please unmute yourself, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, once again, thank you so much for organizing this webinar. It's very useful, it's substantive, it is productive. I think that this has enhanced awareness about the current challenges that we face. And I really appreciate your commitment to Kashmir, because, you've gone back to Lahore. I think this is very good. You are in your prime seat, So thank you so much for focusing on Kashmir all over again. Now, about third-party mediation, I can share this with you that before 2019, August 2019, we were trying to persuade some international statesmen. For instance, Norwegian politician, Mr. Bondevik, former Prime Minister, or probably Mr. de Klerk of South Africa, or Mr. Gordon Brown of the United Kingdom, so that we could have third-party mediation. As you would recall, that President Trump had offered third-party mediation, and Kashmiris in Pakistan had welcomed that offer, although it turned out to be a fake offer, because he hadn't consulted the Indian government very closely or very authentically before making that offer. So this offer crumbled. But Kashmiris and Pakistanis are ever so keen to have third-party mediation, some form of diplomacy that would help us resolve the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. To Mr. Iftikhar Gilani's question, I would say that the government of Pakistan, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has approached the ICRC several times, but India doesn't allow any international agency to go to the occupied territory. I mean, they have banned international human rights organizations entry. These include Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. I think that in the early phase, Physicians for Human Rights did a report by ICRC is not allowed to go to the prison houses or to the concentration camps. These are off limits for these international organizations. I would like to say that ICRC has not been as proactive as it should have been, because I was in Geneva for years, and I know that the ICRC can play a role. It has to be a bit proactive. And if India denies entry to the ICRC, it has to find some means of communicating with prisoners. Also, as you know, that these two reports which were released by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018 and 2019, they recommended visit of a Human Rights Council mission or the Office of the High Commissioner's visit to the occupied territory, and India has denied permission to that mission as well. Now, the issue of the independence of Kashmir, this goes back to the 1940s. As a matter of fact, it's nothing new. And its earliest proponents were Sheikh Abdullah, who was the most popular leader at that time, and Maharaja of Kashmir. They both wanted an independent Kashmir. But later on, they joined India. And this is one of the reasons that Kashmiris have been suffering for the past 7 decades. There are people in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and Azad Kashmir who demand independence of Kashmir. In the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, their leader, the leader who advocates independence, Yasin Malik, he is in Tihar jail in a very small, tiny cell where he's threatened with execution. Then their party, the JKLF, is banned in the occupied territory. Whereas in Azad Kashmir, the JKLF functions and its leaders can go to the bars, to the universities, to the press clubs, and they can express their point of view. And their leaders are free. So we have a very, very high threshold of tolerance and acceptance of their point of view. That said, I would say that back in 1947 and even today in the occupied territory and in Azad Kashmir, there's an overwhelming support for accession to Pakistan, and it can't be wiped out. I mean, and as far as Kashmiris are concerned, they think that this question, the question of independence versus accession to Pakistan, this can be settled democratically. Although in the United Nations Security Council resolution, there are only two options, but we remain confident that this can be resolved through consultation, through democratic means. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. While I still have you, a last question for you posed by Hassan Werk, who is asking you that for a long time you have struggled for the Kashmir cause and have highlighted this issue on many platforms. How has it been to you in a personal capacity? Is it the ideology or the cause that keeps you going? How do you manage this at a very personal level?
You know, when I was in the diplomatic service in the early 90s, I was posted to the United Nations headquarters in New York. And since then, I have been associated with Kashmir, this campaign for Kashmir, directly or indirectly. And let me tell you that ideology comes second. I have been advocating the cause of Kashmir, or I have been talking about the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, primarily because of the suffering of the helpless mothers, the orphans, the detainees, the boys who were killed there in Jammu and Kashmir in the Indian occupied territory. That's the fuel for me, fuel for my passion. And then, of course, I mean, ideology is important. The people of Jammu and Kashmir must get their right to self-determination. They are not chattel to be bartered away, as Ms. Schofield had pointed out. They are people. They are part of the United Nations Charter, which starts "We the Peoples." So we the people, one chunk of we the peoples resides in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And it is the responsibility of the international community to grant these rights to them as a matter of right, not as a gesture of charity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and all my fellow panelists, for this session. Thank you so much for your time and commitment to the cause in your personal capacities as well. There are so many takeaways from this session, but just to sum it up and let our audience also continue to think about this. Pakistan, as Javed Jabbar rightly points out, needs to put out a global communication strategy if it wants the world to commit to the cause, because it cannot ask the world to commit to the cause if it itself does not appear to be committed enough to do something about it. Secondly, any solution on Kashmir needs to have Kashmiris on board, and it cannot come without their participation in it. We need a direction to keep the momentum going. Marches, protests, rallies, freedom days, they're all fine, but we have a mission at hand and which needs a direction. Pakistan also does not need to give confusing messages. Back channel talks with India at the cost of Kashmir will not be acceptable, not only to the Kashmiris, but also to the Pakistanis. So I think much clarity from GOP needs to come. And time is of the essence. We cannot wait for India to change the demographics in Kashmir and then come out and say, okay, yeah, let's have the plebiscite now. So I think, we are running out of time. But thank you so much on behalf of University of Lahore and Chairman who's made these opening remarks. Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to our continued engagement on this subject, because I believe that all of us have a role to play. Yes, as Victoria said, let's have hope about us. Thank you so much once again. Take care.